Hey, and welcome back to Ontario Cryptids. This is the first episode of the year, and I just want to wish you all a happy new year again to everyone. I hope you're all having a relaxing time these past few days, and I would like to thank you all for a great 2020 year. You have been very supportive this past year, and I loved reading your comments and reading what you had to say. In 2020, I've had some great stories emailed to me, which I know you all enjoyed, and I hope we get a few more in 2021. Anyways, I just want to thank you all for all your support this past year and hope I continue to get them in this upcoming year. So let's start off the year right. Here are 3 great stories for 2021. Okay, let's get right to it. Grab yourself a beverage and get cozy on your couch or chair and sit back and relax. The first story takes place on November 12, 2020. It takes place in Hammock County, Maine, in and around Spectacle Pond, just west of Kingman Brook. Background. I have spent a large part of my life in the woods between Edmonton, where I grew up, and Du Bois, where my grandfather built a hunting fishing camp in the 1920s. Everywhere in between hunting, fishing, camping, and hiking. I have walked those woods since I was 4 years old, and I'm now 61. I know the deer, moose, bear, and other wildlife of those woods. I built my camp on Spectacle Pond in Osborne in 1988. I have spent a lot of time in the years since exploring the woods and waters around the camp. Over the years, I know the area between Route 179 and Route 193 better than most, and within 10 miles of my camp, better than anyone. Since 2008, when I retired from the U.S. Navy, I have spent 1 month every year at my camp, 2 weeks in May, fishing, and 2 weeks in November, hunting. I have spent many days and nights in the most remote areas of that part of Maine. On the evening of November 12, 2020, my wife and I had returned to our camp after an afternoon deer hunt. It was dark by the time we got back to camp and settled in for our routine evening with getting the camp warmed up, supper, a couple of hands of cribbage, and talking. We had been in camp for 10 days. At around 8:30, my wife decided to go to bed as we planned to hunt in the morning. I picked up my book and I was reading until 10:30. The only light within half a mile of my camp was a single gas light in the front room of the camp, which I was using to read. The nearest people were 0.5 miles away in their camp back towards Route 9. I decided to call it a night at 10:30, and I wanted to relieve myself before I went to bed. So I went outside across the porch, down the front steps, and walked approximately 15 feet to the back outside corner of the camp. Within seconds of standing in that spot, there was 2 very loud twawk sounds just inside the wood line, which is 15 yards across the backyard. It took me by surprise, as I have never heard that sound before completely by myself in the woods. It sounded identical to someone taking a large stick of firewood and hitting a tree in full swing. I could easily replicate that noise as in knocking snow ice off firewood against a tree, but with force. I did not have a flashlight with me, as a diffused light from the gas light inside the camp gave me enough point of reference to get back inside, so I didn't think to bring one with me. I stood there perplexed as to what I had just heard and trying to make sense of it, when it happened again. Twawk, but this time a little further away. maybe 25 to 30 yards, but still quite loud. This repeated itself 10 or 11 times over a period of maybe 2 to 3 minutes, each time a little more distance than before. I remained standing there as I was still trying to figure out what it was twalking these trees. After the hitting of the trees dissipated, I returned to the camp and locked the doors. I didn't and still don't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't a person, moose, deer, or bear. Of note, there was absolutely no light as in a flashlight from a person. Additionally, those woods are extremely thick with dead spruce and fir. Lots of blowdowns, yet there was absolutely no noise, no snapping branches or breaking twigs. Nothing. Silence. I can tell you firsthand that nobody could walk down through there in broad daylight, much less at night without a flashlight, without snapping branches and making a lot of noise. I spent an additional hour in the camp that night reflecting on what I had heard and trying to attribute it to something that made sense. There was none in all of my experience. I went to bed, and when we got up Friday morning, we decided to hang out at camp to get a start on packing and cleaning as we were closing up camp and leaving on Saturday. I walked into the woods during daylight where I heard the twalk noises that night before, but found nothing where I expected to see some type of sign. Needless to say, I didn't tell my wife about those events until Saturday morning as we were getting ready to leave. I still have no idea what it was, and it was so dark I didn't see anything, but I can tell you that I've never heard or experienced anything like that in the many years I have spent in those woods and the 30+ years I have owned the camp. This was another interesting encounter. Very curious as to what was making those noises. The fact that nothing else was breaking, no sticks or anything like that, as we commonly hear, it kind of makes this one very intriguing as to what the origin of the sounds were. Great story. Okay, let's move on to story number 2. All right, this story takes place in the fall of 2000 in Cass County, Texas, in and around the town of Linden. My story happened in 2000, about 40 years ago. It was me, my mom, and my father out fishing in a small wash on the side of the road. So I was living here in Oklahoma and talking to my mom. She said they found a new fishing hole off the side of the road where they had been catching a lot of fish. I know the area. I was pessimistic. I drove down one weekend to visit, go check out the fishing hole, and lo and behold, there was good fishing there. So I go down and fish with my mom and dad in the wash several more times. This one particular time is when the sighting happened. We were all fishing this wash for several hours and the sun was starting to set. It was just getting dusk when me and my mom, now on the opposite side of the road from my dad, began to hear footsteps in the water. This is how the conversation goes. Mom, do you hear that? Me, yes. Mom, what is that? Me, must be a deer. Mom, no, it sounds like it's walking. Me, yes, a deer walking through the water. You can hear its steps. Mom, no, it sounds like it's walking on 2 feet because a deer has 4 legs and you'll be able to hear them. Me, I don't know, sounds like a deer to me. Mom, listen closely. Whatever it is, it's walking on 2 legs and coming this way. So at this point, I'm unsure of what I'm hearing now. I am now leaning towards hearing the footsteps of a person and not a deer. We listen for several more minutes as whatever this was getting closer and more distinct. As we look up the wash is when we see this thing casually walking down the wash. At this point, I'm convinced now it is a person. Mom, look at that thing. What is that? Me, gotta be a hunter. Mom, walking in the river? Me, well, maybe this someone around here is trying to scare us because they don't want us fishing here. So the entire time that we're having this discussion, this thing is still walking towards us. As it's in front of us head on, you can see that it is massive. I'm still thinking that it's a guy in a ghillie suit. Then I immediately think to myself, well, how deep is this water here? How soft is the bottom? It's like a marsh because this guy is walking smoothly enough through the water effortlessly. Again, it was dusk at this point. This thing was literally 20 feet in front of us in the wide open. Since it was dusk, just past sunset, where you still have the moment of visibility, you can see how big it was. There was a piece of fencing there and some stumps in its way, so it turned to our left and walked up the hill. At this point, we yelled to our dad, "Let's get out of here!" He was confused as to what we were screaming about, so we chucked everything in the car and left. I do not remember talking about it much besides, what the hell was that? After we got home, I never talked to my mom or dad about it. I ended up going back to Oklahoma after the weekend was over. None of us ever talked about it again after that moment. Not sure why, but to me, it quickly became a distant memory. I was unsure of what the hell just happened anyways, so I never thought about looking into it any further. I believe that people are seeing what they claim, but it is so incomprehensible at the moment you are witnessing it that your brain is not comprehending. That's what I felt like. For me, it was like my brain was stuck in the middle of understanding what I was seeing and not understanding. My mom passed away the next year in 2001. I never got to ask her what her thoughts were about that day, not until I started seeing the show Finding Bigfoot on TV. I started thinking, maybe this is what it was. I still struggle with understanding what I saw because these types of shows actually makes me doubt myself. My story does not seem to fit into what Matt, Cliff, and Bobo say is what seems to be the normal Bigfoot behavior to me. I doubt myself because I never smelled a foul odor. It never made a noise, like it didn't see us standing right in front of it. If it saw us, it didn't run. It didn't hide. So it was not until 19 years later, after watching that show, that I decide to get on the computer and look at the terrain in the area. I had no clue there was a lake there at all. I'm not saying I saw Bigfoot. I did not know what the hell I saw. All I know is I'm 6'1". I was standing on the road and the water line was like 3 to 4 feet below the road. This thing was about eye level, if not taller, and twice as wide as I was at the time. Just massive. I couldn't make out any details besides how big it was. I grew up in these woods, fishing, hunting, whatever. I never heard of talk about anything like this, nor have I seen anything like this. This area is not known for bears. I don't think so anyways. I've never seen one. But if a bear can walk on 2 legs through a creek and turn and walk up the embankment on 2 legs, then I saw a bear. I never thought about even sharing my story with anyone until I saw that TV show. I did try telling some people about my experience, and they just laughed and made jokes, even my sister. I just stopped trying to tell them, even though they still live in that area. Thank you for hearing me out. Well, thank you for sharing your story, and this is why channels like mine exist. It's to simply tell people's stories as they encounter them. And there shouldn't be anybody out there who should try to discredit your story based on on what's actually happened to you, because it's happened to you. It hasn't happened to me, and it hasn't happened to anybody else. It happened to you and your mother. And so there's nothing, you can't undo it. If it happens, it happens, and you live with what you've seen, even though, as you stated, you can't explain what you've seen. And you're not trying to either. I mean, you think maybe it's a Bigfoot, and in other ways you're thinking, well, maybe it's not because of X, Y, and Z. And that's your prerogative. But I do want to thank you for sharing your story. I think this was a great story. I am sorry to hear that your mother passed away. But again, thanks for writing this up. Okay, so this is the last story of the day. This one takes place October 12th, 2020 in Jackson County, Illinois. Me, my wife, and another hiking buddy, a female, had just hiked 7 miles from the entrance of Red Cedar Trail at Giant City State Park to the primitive campsite where we set up our sleeping arrangements. My wife set up her tent against the northwest part of the site. I was sleeping in a hammock and cocoon with a hammock tarp as my shelter southwest of her. My friend was also in a hammock tarp southeast of my wife's tent. After setting up our sleeping arrangements, we started a fire with some fell wood that we found laying around the site. Once the fire was going good, we sat down and reconstituted some dehydrated food that we hiked in with. We drank tea and ate until our bellies were full. Afterwards, me and my wife went to bed, while my friend stayed up and played on her phone. After a few minutes, she went to bed as well. To be perfectly transparent, I want to share a detail which may be of use to critics, but I know better as it relates to my story. Where I had my hammock, walnuts occasionally fall from the trees and hit my tarp and rolled off onto the campsite grounds. This was a common event and one I'm used to hearing as an avid hiker. I'm no novice to forest sounds and behaviors. The night progressed and the fire burnt out. I remember poking my head out of the cocoon and looking at the fire to see how dim it was becoming. Because the campsite was so remote, I knew it would soon be pitch black. I remember a walnut falling off the tree and striking my tarp. It rolled off into the darkness and found its resting spot. The fire grew dimmer and dimmer until I grew bored of watching it. I zipped myself back within the cocoon and fell asleep. Sometime later, a loud thud woke me from my sleep. Maybe another walnut, I thought. Only it wasn't. It couldn't have been. Nothing ever hit the ground. Nothing rolled away off the top of my pitch tarp. My heart raced. As I said before, I'm an avid hiker-camper and always look out of my hammock and under my tarp to see what's in the camp, but this time was different. I froze and couldn't move. It was like an involuntary fear that I've rarely experienced. I stayed that way until I calmed down, but never mustered the courage to look outside of my cocoon. The next morning, the first thing my wife tells me was that a bipedal creature was walking around her tent last night. My friend said, "Mine too." I tell them, "Something slapped my shelter." I go on to explain that it wasn't a walnut that fell on my tarp because it never hit the ground. My wife then tells us both that she heard 2 howls several minutes later and that they were about 15 minutes apart. According to her, the howl sounds like a sign that paused at a very high pitch, then broke into 2 small howls, then paused and 2 more small howls. That repeated itself another time. Me and my friend didn't hear anything, likely because we had fallen back to sleep. We left that campsite knowing we had an unexplainable experience. Although my friend is hesitant to believe it was the big guy, She does not deny that something with 2 legs was walking around her that night. As for me, I remain convinced that something slapped my tarp. My wife believes it was because I was a man while her and my friend were female. Regardless, something with 2 legs entered our camp and in the dead of the night in pitch blackness and left us unharmed but fearful to look outside. We all shared that sense of fear and dread that we felt, but left the park not seeing the big guy, but at least 2 of us believing we were in close proximity to it. Wow, that was a very cool story. Now, I do a lot of camping, but I've never camped in a hammock before where you're suspended in the air and you have a tarp covering yourself. I've always camped on the ground in a tent. But again, I've never also camped remotely. This sounds like it was a primitive campsite, which probably means there's not a lot of people around you. I don't know. I've never really been to a primitive campsite. I've always camped in campgrounds that are, there's people around. Yes, there's a lot of vegetation and trees and bushes in between you and the next campsite, but there's people in the general area. So it's unlikely to have something like that happen to you unless it's at the end of the camping season. But yeah, I've always camped on the ground. But what a fantastic story. As promised, these were 3 great stories, and we flew pretty much all over the U.S. to get these stories out to you. Now, I think next time up, we're going to look for stories in Canada. I don't think I've had any Canadian stories as of late, but we'll see if we can find any. And if these stories reminded you of an incident or an encounter that you may have had, then please go ahead and forward your stories to OntarioCryptids@gmail.com. Now, I hope you guys are enjoying the new year. And I don't know about you guys, but it's been a lazy couple of days for me, just laying around and watching movies. So, on that note, I am going to leave you all, and we will catch you all next week.